Imagine this. A quiet, unassuming neighborhood where nothing extraordinary ever seems to happen. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and life moves at a pace so slow it feels like time itself has taken a nap. But what if I told you that in this very neighborhood, something so shocking, so unbelievable, unfolded, that it left everyone questioning everything they thought they knew? What if I told you that beneath the surface of this sleepy town, a story was brewing, one that would make your jaw drop, your heart race, and your mind spin? This is the story of a man who thought he had it all figured out, a man who tried to scam an old woman, only to discover that she was far from what she seemed. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to get the answers you've been searching for. So, buckle up, because this is one wild ride you won't want to miss. Let me ask you something. Have you ever underestimated someone? Maybe you thought they were too quiet, too kind, or just too ordinary to be anything other than what they appeared to be. We've all been there, right? It's human nature to make assumptions, to judge a book by its cover. But what happens when that book turns out to be a gripping thriller with twists you never saw coming? That's exactly what happened to our main character, a man who thought he could outsmart an old woman, only to find out that she was the one holding all the cards. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could an old woman possibly outsmart a scammer? And that's exactly the question that's going to keep you hooked. Because this isn't just a story about a scam gone wrong. It's a story about secrets, about identities, and about the lengths people will go to protect what's theirs. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust, deception, and the power of perception. And the best part? You're going to get all the answers right here in this video. Let's set the stage. Picture a small, cozy house at the end of a tree-lined street. The kind of house that looks like it's been there forever, with a porch swing that creaks in the wind and a garden that's just a little overgrown. Inside that house lives Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a woman in her late 70s who spends her days knitting, baking, and tending to her flowers. To everyone in the neighborhood, she's just sweet old Mrs. Whitaker, harmless, kind, and maybe a little forgetful. But what no one knows is that Mrs. Whitaker has a past. A past that's about to come crashing into the present in the most unexpected way. Enter our scammer, a man we'll call Jack. Jack is smooth, charming, and always on the lookout for an easy score. He's the kind of guy who can talk his way out of anything, and he's made a career out of preying on the vulnerable. When he sets his sights on Mrs. Whitaker, he thinks he's hit the jackpot. An old woman, living alone with no family to speak of? It's the perfect mark. Or so he thinks. What Jack doesn't know is that Mrs. Whitaker is anything but an easy target. Sure, she might look like your typical grandmother, but there's a steeliness in her eyes that hints at something more. Something hidden. Something dangerous. And as Jack begins to weave his web of lies, he has no idea that he's walking straight into a trap, one that's been years in the making. Now, I'm not going to spoil the details for you here. You're going to have to keep watching to find out what happens next. But I will tell you this, the moment Jack realizes who Mrs. Whitaker really is, it's a moment you won't forget. It's a moment that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about people, about trust, and about the power of secrets. So, what do you think? Are you ready to dive into this story and uncover the truth? Are you ready to find out what happens when a scammer meets his match in the most unlikely of places? If the answer is yes, then you're in the right place. Because this video is going to take you on a journey you won't soon forget. A journey filled with twists, turns, and revelations that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But before we go any further, I want to talk to you for a moment. Yes, you. The person watching this video right now. I want you to think about why you clicked on this story. Was it the title? The mystery? The promise of something unexpected? Whatever the reason, I want you to know that you're here for a reason. You're here because you're curious, because you want to know what happens next. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to get the answers you're looking for. So let's make a deal, you and I. You keep watching, and I'll keep delivering the story. A story that's going to make you laugh, make you gasp, and maybe even make you rethink the way you see the world. A story that's going to stay with you long after the video ends. Because that's what great stories do. They stick with you. They make you think. They make you feel. And this story? It's going to do all of that and more. Now, let's get back to Jack and Mrs. Whitaker. As Jack begins to put his plan into motion, he starts to notice little things. Things that don't quite add up. A locked drawer in the living room that Mrs. Whitaker never opens. A phone call she takes in hushed tones, late at night. A photograph tucked away in a dusty album, showing a much younger Mrs. Whitaker in a uniform, standing next to people who look important. Jack brushes it off at first, chalking it up to the eccentricities of an old woman. But as the days go by, he can't shake the feeling that there's more to Mrs. Whitaker than meets the eye. And then, one night, it happens. Jack is in the house, searching for something, anything that he can use to his advantage. He's in the living room, rifling through drawers, when he hears a noise behind him. He turns, and there's Mrs. Whitaker standing in the doorway. But she's not the sweet, harmless old woman he thought she was. No, this Mrs. Whitaker is different. Her eyes are sharp, her posture is straight, and in her hand, she's holding something that makes Jack's blood run cold. What happens next? Well, you're just gonna have to keep watching to find out. Because this is where the story takes a turn you won't see coming. A turn that will leave you breathless, eager for more, and desperate to know how it all ends. So, what do you say? Are you ready to uncover the truth? Are you ready to find out who Mrs. Whitaker really is? Then don't go anywhere, because the best is yet to come. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Jack had always been a man who thrived on risk. It was in his blood, a part of who he was. Growing up in a rough neighborhood where survival often meant outsmarting those around you, he had learned early on that the world was divided into two kinds of people, the predators and the prey. And Jack had no intention of ever being the latter. Over the years, he had honed his craft, perfecting the art of the con. He knew how to read people, how to spot their weaknesses, and how to exploit them. It was a skill that had served him well, allowing him to live a life of relative comfort, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. But lately, things had started to feel different. The thrill of the scam, the rush of pulling one over on someone, had begun to lose its luster. It wasn't that he was getting sloppy. No, Jack was too good for that. It was more that the stakes no longer felt high enough. He needed a challenge, something that would reignite the fire that had driven him for so long. And that's when he met Mrs. Whitaker. At first glance, she seemed like the perfect mark. A sweet, elderly woman living alone in a house that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. She was polite, unassuming, and, most importantly, isolated. Jack had done his homework, or so he thought. He had watched her for weeks, learning her routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. She had no family to speak of, no close friends who visited regularly. She was, in every sense of the word, alone. And to Jack, that made her the ideal target. But as he began to dig deeper, he started to notice things that didn't quite add up. For one, there was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence about her, a sense of self-assurance that didn't quite fit the image of a lonely old woman. Then there were the little things, the way she always seemed to be listening, even when she appeared to be lost in thought, or the way her eyes would flicker with something unreadable whenever he asked too many questions. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but with Mrs. Whitaker, he found himself second-guessing. It was as if she was always one step ahead, always just out of reach. And then there were the rumors. Small, whispered things that he had picked up from the neighbors. Stories about a woman who had once been someone important, someone powerful. A woman who had disappeared from the public eye decades ago, only to resurface in this quiet, unremarkable town. At first, Jack had dismissed them as nothing more than idle gossip. After all, everyone loved a good mystery, and small towns were always full of tall tales. But the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that there might be some truth to them. As the days turned into weeks, Jack found himself becoming increasingly obsessed with Mrs. Whitaker. He started to notice things he hadn't before, the way she always locked her doors at night, even in a neighborhood where crime was virtually non-existent, the way she seemed to have a sixth sense for when someone was watching her, the way she would sometimes disappear for hours at a time, only to return with no explanation. It was as if she was living a double life, one that she had carefully hidden from the world. And Jack was determined to uncover it. But the deeper he dug, the more he began to realize that he might be in over his head. There were moments when he would catch her looking at him, her eyes sharp and calculating, as if she knew exactly what he was up to. And then there were the times when he would find himself second-guessing his own instincts, wondering if he was the one being played. It was a dangerous game, one that Jack wasn't sure he could win. But by then, it was too late to back out. He had already invested too much time, too much energy, too much of himself. He needed to see it through, no matter the cost. And then, one night, everything changed. Jack had been in the house, searching for something, anything that could give him the upper hand. He had been careful, or so he thought, moving silently through the shadows, avoiding the creaky floorboards, the loose tiles. But as he stood there, rifling through a drawer in the living room, he heard a noise behind him. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and slowly turned around. And there she was. Mrs. Whitaker, standing in the doorway, her eyes locked on his. But this wasn't the sweet, harmless old woman he had thought he knew. No, this was someone else entirely. In her hand, she held a gun, steady and unwavering. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was a hardness in her eyes that sent a chill down Jack's spine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, the silence deafening. And then, finally, Mrs. Whitaker broke the silence. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had she known? How had she seen through him so easily? And more importantly, what was she going to do next? He opened his mouth to speak, to try to talk his way out of this, but the words caught in his throat. Because in that moment, he realized something that sent a wave of dread crashing over him. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was real. And he had no idea what he was up against. As Mrs. Whitaker stepped closer, the gun still trained on him, Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. And as he stood there, staring into the eyes of a woman who was clearly far more than she seemed, he couldn't help but wonder, who was Mrs. Whitaker, really? And what had he gotten himself into? The answers, of course, were coming. But they weren't going to be what Jack or anyone else expected. Because this story was far from over. And the twists and turns that lay ahead were going to change everything. So, stay tuned. Because the truth is about to be revealed, and it's going to blow your mind. As Jack stood frozen in Mrs. Whitaker's living room, the weight of the gun in her hand and the steeliness in her eyes, making it clear that this was no ordinary confrontation. His mind raced to piece together how he had gotten here. But before he could even begin to formulate a plan, a sharp knock at the front door shattered the tension like a hammer through glass. Mrs. Whitaker's gaze flicked toward the sound, her expression unreadable, but the gun never wavered. For a moment, Jack considered making a run for it, but something in her demeanor told him that would be a fatal mistake. Instead, he stayed rooted to the spot, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a man's voice, deep and authoritative. "Mrs. Whitaker, it's Detective Harris. We need to speak with you." Jack's stomach dropped. Detective. What was going on? He glanced at Mrs. Whitaker, searching for some clue, some reaction, but her face was a mask of calm. She didn't seem surprised by the interruption. If anything, she almost looked relieved. Without taking her eyes off Jack, she called out, "Just a moment, Detective. I'll be right there." Her voice was steady, almost cheerful, as if she hadn't just been pointing a gun at an intruder in her home. She motioned for Jack to move toward the hallway with a subtle tilt of her head, her expression warning him not to make a sound. Reluctantly, he obeyed, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this detective, and why was he here? And why did Mrs. Whitaker seem so prepared for this? As Jack slipped into the shadows of the hallway, he heard the front door open and the murmur of voices. He strained to listen, catching snippets of the conversation. "We've had a report of suspicious activity in the area," the detective was saying. "We're just checking in to make sure everything's all right." Mrs. Whitaker's response was calm, almost too calm. "Oh, everything's fine, Detective. Just a quiet evening at home. But I appreciate you checking in." There was a pause, and then the detective's voice again, lower this time, almost conspiratorial. "You know, if you ever need anything at all, you can call us. We're here to help." Jack's mind raced. Suspicious activity? Was that about him? Or was there something else going on here? And why did it feel like the detective's words carried a double meaning? Before he could process it further, the door closed, and Mrs. Whitaker's footsteps echoed down the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, the gun now tucked into the waistband of her apron, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the couch. Her tone left no room for argument. As Jack sat, his mind still reeling, Mrs. Whitaker began to speak. But what she said next only deepened the mystery. "You're not the first to come looking for me," she said, her voice low and measured. "And you won't be the last. But you're different, aren't you? You're not here because of them. You're here because of curiosity. Am I right?" Jack didn't know how to respond. Who were they? And what did she mean by curiosity? Before he could ask, she continued. "But here's the thing, Jack, or whatever your name is, you've stumbled into something much bigger than you realize. And if you're not careful, It's going to swallow you whole." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to ask her what she meant, to demand answers, but before he could, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was jarring in the tense silence, and Mrs. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Answer it," she said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Reluctantly, Jack pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number, just 2 words, "Get out." His blood ran cold. Who had sent this? And how did they know where he was? He looked up at Mrs. Whitaker, but her expression gave nothing away. If anything, she seemed almost amused. "Looks like someone's looking out for you," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I wouldn't count on it lasting. You're in over your head, Jack. And if you don't walk away now, you're going to regret it." Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo, a grainy black and white image of a man standing in the shadows, watching what appeared to be Mrs. Whitaker's house. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken just minutes ago. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? And why was he watching the house? Mrs. Whitaker must have seen the fear in his eyes because she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You see now, don't you? This isn't just about me. It's about something much bigger. And if you're not careful, you're going to find yourself caught in the middle of something you can't escape." Jack's mind was a whirlwind of questions, but before he could ask any of them, a loud crash from outside shattered the silence. Mrs. Whitaker's head snapped toward the window, her expression hardening. "Stay here," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. And then, before Jack could react, she was gone, moving with a speed and agility that belied her age. As Jack sat there, his mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a nightmare. Who was Mrs. Whitaker really? Who was the man outside? And who had sent him that text? The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't fit together, not yet. And as the sound of footsteps echoed outside, Jack realized one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer in control. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the game had changed. But the question remained, who was really pulling the strings? And how far was Jack willing to go to find out? The answers were coming, but they weren't going to be what anyone expected. And as the tension continued to rise, one thing was clear: no one could be trusted. Not even Mrs. Whitaker. So, what do you think happens next? Who is the man outside? And what is Mrs. Whitaker hiding? The truth is closer than you think, but it's going to take more than curiosity to uncover it. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. As Jack sat alone in Mrs. Whitaker's living room, the weight of her cryptic warnings and the ominous text message still fresh in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and no matter how hard he tried, they refused to fit together. Who was the man outside? Who had sent the text? And why did Mrs. Whitaker seem to know more about him than he did about her? The questions swirled in his head, each one more unsettling than the last. But just as he was about to give up, to walk away and leave this madness behind, something caught his eye. It was a photograph, partially hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers on the coffee table. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. It was Mrs. Whitaker, much younger, standing beside a man in a military uniform. But it wasn't just any man, it was someone Jack recognized. Someone he knew.
His breath hitched as he picked up the photo, his hands trembling slightly.
Because the man in the picture wasn't a stranger. It was his father. Jack's mind reeled. His father had died when he was just a kid, or so he had always been told. A car accident, his mother had said. A tragic, senseless loss. But here he was, alive and well in this photograph, standing beside Mrs. Whitaker like they were old friends. Or more than friends. Jack's heart pounded as he stared at the image, his mind racing to make sense of it. What was his father doing with Mrs. Whitaker? And why had no one ever told him about this? Before he could process it further, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, pulling him back to the present. He quickly tucked the photo into his pocket, his heart racing as Mrs. Whitaker reappeared in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Now." Jack blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "Leave? Why? What's going on?" Mrs. Whitaker didn't answer. Instead, she moved quickly through the room, gathering a few items, a small bag, a set of keys, a file folder stuffed with papers. Her movements were precise, practiced, as if she had done this 100 times before. Jack watched her, his mind spinning. Who was this woman, really? And why did it feel like she had been preparing for this moment for years? "Listen to me carefully," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes were sharp, her voice steady but urgent. "There's no time to explain everything, but you need to trust me. If we don't leave now, neither of us will make it out of here alive." Jack wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in her tone stopped him. This wasn't the sweet, harmless old woman he had thought she was. This was someone else entirely, someone who had been living a double life, someone who had secrets that could get them both killed. And as much as he hated to admit it, he needed her. At least for now. Reluctantly, he followed her out the back door and into the night. The air was cool, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the neighborhood in shadow. Mrs. Whitaker moved quickly and silently, her steps sure and confident, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Jack struggled to keep up, his mind still reeling from the discovery of the photograph. Who was she, really? And what did she know about his father? They had just reached the edge of the property when a voice called out from the darkness. "Eleanor! Stop right there!" Jack froze, his heart pounding as a figure stepped into view. It was the detective from earlier, his badge glinting in the faint light. But something about him was different now. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. Mrs. Whitaker didn't stop. Instead, she grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him forward, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't look back," she whispered. "Just keep moving." But Jack couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he saw the detective raise his hand not in a gesture of peace, but to reveal a gun. "I said stop," the detective barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Jack's mind raced. Why was the detective pointing a gun at them? What had Mrs. Whitaker done to make him so desperate? And why did it feel like he was the one being hunted? Before he could process it further, Mrs. Whitaker yanked him around the corner and into a narrow alley. "This way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to lose him." Jack followed, his heart pounding as they darted through the maze of back streets and alleys. The detective's footsteps echoed behind them, growing fainter with each turn, but Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet. Not even close. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Whitaker pulled him into a small, dimly lit garage and closed the door behind them. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "What the hell is going on?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. "Who are you? And why is that detective after us?" Mrs. Whitaker turned to face him, her expression grim. "It's not just him," she said. "It's them. They've been watching me for years. And now that you're involved, they'll be watching you too." Jack's stomach churned. "Who's them? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a file, handing it to him. "This will explain everything," she said. "But you need to understand something, Jack. This isn't just about me. It's about you too. And if you want to survive, you're going to have to trust me." Jack stared at the file, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings, all of them pointing to a conspiracy far bigger than he could have imagined. And at the center of it all was a name he recognized. His father's name. The room seemed to spin as Jack realized the truth. His father hadn't died in a car accident. He had been killed. And Mrs. Whitaker, this woman he had underestimated, this woman he had tried to scam, had been trying to protect him all along. But from what? And why? The answers were in the file, but Jack wasn't sure he was ready to face them. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't just a story about a scam gone wrong. This was a story about betrayal, about secrets, about a web of lies that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. And as the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, Jack realized one thing with absolute certainty: his life would never be the same. So, what do you think happens next? Who is after them? And what secrets are hidden in that file? The truth is closer than you think, but it's going to take more than courage to uncover it. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Jack's hands trembled as he flipped through the file Mrs. Whitaker had given him, each page revealing another layer of the labyrinth he had stumbled into. The documents were a mix of classified reports, surveillance photos, and handwritten notes, all pointing to a conspiracy that stretched back decades. His father's name appeared again and again, linked to shadowy organizations, covert operations, and a betrayal so profound it made Jack's stomach churn. But it wasn't just his father's past that haunted him. It was the realization that his entire life had been built on lies. His mother's stories about his father's death, the quiet, unremarkable childhood he had always taken for granted, even the sense of identity he had clung to, all of it was a carefully constructed facade. And now, standing in that dimly lit garage with Mrs. Whitaker, Jack felt the ground crumbling beneath him. Mrs. Whitaker watched him carefully, her expression a mix of sympathy and urgency. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said, her voice softer now, almost maternal. "But we don't have time for you to process it all. They're coming, Jack. And when they find us, they won't ask questions. They'll just clean up the mess." Jack looked up at her, his mind racing. "Who are they? What do they want?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. "They're part of something much bigger than you can imagine. A network of people who operate in the shadows, pulling strings, covering their tracks. Your father was one of them until he wasn't. He tried to expose them, to bring the truth to light. And that's why he had to disappear." Jack's chest tightened. "So he's alive?" Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I don't know. But what I do know is that they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. And now that you've seen this," she gestured to the file in his hands, "you're a threat to them. Just like your father was." The weight of her words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had always thought of himself as a predator, someone who could outsmart anyone, manipulate any situation to his advantage. But this was something else entirely. This was a game where the rules were written in blood, and the stakes were life and death. Before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the silence. Mrs. Whitaker's head snapped toward the door, her body tensing. "They're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move. Now." Jack's heart pounded as she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a back exit. But as they reached the door, she stopped and turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice urgent. "They'll use anyone to get to you. Your friends, your family, anyone you care about. If you want to survive, you're going to have to make some hard choices. And you're going to have to make them fast." Jack's mind raced. Hard choices. What did that even mean? But before he could ask, the sound of voices outside, harsh, commanding voices, sent a jolt of panic through him. Mrs. Whitaker didn't wait for a response. She pushed him through the door and into the night, her grip firm and unyielding. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, their footsteps silent against the pavement. But as they turned a corner, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated, then pulled it out, his stomach dropping as he saw the name on the screen. It was his mother. He stared at the phone, his mind spinning. His mother had always been the one constant in his life, the one person he could count on no matter what. But now, after everything he had just learned, he wasn't sure he could trust her. What if she had been lying to him all along? What if she was part of this? Mrs. Whitaker glanced back at him, her eyes narrowing as she saw the phone in his hand. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not safe." But Jack couldn't help himself. He needed to hear her voice, to know if she was okay or if she was part of the nightmare he had stumbled into. He hit answer and brought the phone to his ear, his heart pounding. "Mom?" The voice on the other end wasn't his mother's. It was a man's voice, cold and emotionless. "Jack," the man said, his tone sending a chill down Jack's spine. "We have her. If you want to see her alive again, you'll do exactly as we say." Jack's blood ran cold. "Where is she? What did you do to her?" The man ignored his questions. "You have 1 hour to bring us the file. Come alone. If we see anyone else, if you try anything stupid, she dies. Do you understand?" Jack's mind raced. The file. They wanted the file. But if he gave it to them, he'd be handing over the only leverage he had, the only chance he had to uncover the truth. And if he didn't? Mrs. Whitaker was watching him, her expression grim. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. "They've got her, don't they?" she said, her voice low. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "They want the file. They said, if I don't bring it to them in an hour, they'll kill her." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes hardened. "It's a trap, Jack. They're not going to let either of you walk away." "I don't have a choice," Jack snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "She's my mother." Mrs. Whitaker studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You always have a choice, Jack. But sometimes there are no good ones." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unrelenting. Jack felt like he was being torn in two. On one side was his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had been his anchor in a world that had always felt unstable. On the other was the truth, a truth that could change everything, but that might cost him the only family he had left. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him back to the present. Mrs. Whitaker grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "We need to go," she whispered. "Now." But Jack hesitated. He couldn't just leave his mother to die. He couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. But if he went after her, if he handed over the file, he might be signing his own death warrant and hers. As the footsteps grew closer, Jack realized he was out of time. He had to make a choice. And no matter what he decided, there would be no going back. So, what do you think happens next? Does Jack risk everything to save his mother? Or does he choose the truth, knowing it might cost him the only family he has left? The stakes have never been higher, and the choices have never been harder. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Jack's mind was a storm of fear, anger, and desperation as he stood in the shadows, clutching the file that had become both his lifeline and his curse. The footsteps were closer now, echoing through the narrow alley like a drumbeat counting down to disaster. Mrs. Whitaker's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes darting toward the sound. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "If they find us, it's over." But Jack couldn't move. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him like a physical force. His mother's life hung in the balance, and every second he hesitated felt like a betrayal. Yet deep down, he knew Mrs. Whitaker was right. Handing over the file wouldn't save his mother, it would only seal both their fates. The people hunting them weren't the kind to keep their word. They were predators, just like he had once been, but far more dangerous. Before he could make a decision, a voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. "We know you're here, Jack. Come out, and we'll make this quick." Jack's blood ran cold. He recognized that voice. It wasn't the detective from earlier, or the cold, emotionless man who had called him on the phone. It was someone else entirely, someone he had trusted. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened as she saw the realization dawn on his face. "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice tense. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt like it was closing in on itself as he stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised in surrender. Standing at the end of the alley, flanked by two armed men, was his uncle, his father's brother, the man who had been like a second father to him after his dad's supposed death. "Uncle Greg?" Jack's voice cracked, the words barely more than a whisper. Greg's expression was cold, his eyes devoid of the warmth Jack had always associated with him. "Jack," he said, his tone flat and emotionless. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in this. You should have just walked away." Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Greg didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to one of the men beside him, who stepped forward and grabbed Jack by the arm, wrenching the file from his hands. Jack struggled, but the man's grip was like iron. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice echoing through the alley. "What are you doing? Where's my mom?" Greg's expression didn't change. "Your mother is safe for now. But whether she stays that way is up to you." Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. His uncle, the man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had been there for him after his father's death, was part of this. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Mrs. Whitaker stepped out of the shadows then, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Greg," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to do this. You can still walk away." Greg's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment Jack thought he saw a flicker of hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You should have stayed hidden, Eleanor," he said, his voice cold. You were supposed to be dead. Mrs. Whitaker didn't flinch. And you were supposed to be better than this. What would your brother say if he could see you now? Greg's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Jack. You've got one chance to make this right, he said. Tell us where the rest of the files are, and we'll let your mother go. Refuse, and he trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. Jack's mind raced. The rest of the files? What was he talking about? He didn't have any other files. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Whitaker spoke up. He doesn't know, she said, her voice steady. I never told him. Greg's eyes narrowed. Then you'll tell us. Mrs. Whitaker shook her head. I won't. Not after everything you've done. Greg's expression darkened, and he nodded to the man holding Jack. Do it. The man raised his gun, pressing it against Jack's temple. Jack's breath caught, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would burst. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a sudden commotion, shouts, the sound of scuffling, and then a voice Jack hadn't heard in years. Let him go. Jack's eyes flew open, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing at the other end of the alley, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight, was his father. The world seemed to stop. Jack's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. His father alive here, after all these years. But before he could say anything, his father raised a hand, silencing him. Not now, he said, his voice low and urgent. We need to move. Greg's expression was a mix of shock and fury. You, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. You were supposed to be dead. Jack's father didn't respond. Instead, he raised a gun of his own, his eyes locked on Greg. Let him go, he repeated, his voice cold and commanding. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. And then, chaos erupted. Shots rang out, the sound deafening in the narrow alley. Jack dropped to the ground, his hands over his head as the world around him dissolved into chaos. He heard shouts, the sound of footsteps, and then a hand grabbing his arm, pulling him to his feet. Come on, his father shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. We need to go. Jack didn't argue. He let his father pull him to his feet and drag him down the alley, Mrs. Whitaker close behind. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the night, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. But as they turned a corner, Jack's father stopped, his expression grim. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. They'll keep coming. And now that they know you're involved, they won't stop until they've silenced you for good. Jack's mind was spinning, his emotions a tangled mess of relief, anger, and fear. His father was alive. His uncle had betrayed him. And now he was caught in the middle of a conspiracy that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. As they disappeared into the night, Jack realized one thing with absolute certainty. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But the cost of finding it might be more than he was willing to pay. So, what do you think happens next? Will Jack uncover the truth, or will the conspiracy swallow him whole? The stakes have never been higher, and the danger has never been greater. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. The safe house was anything but safe. Tucked away in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, it was a place Jack's father had described as the last place they'd look. But as Jack sat on a rickety chair, the dim glow of a single bulb casting long shadows across the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. His father and Mrs. Whitaker were huddled in the corner, speaking in hushed tones, their faces etched with worry. Jack wanted to demand answers, to scream at them for keeping him in the dark for so long, but the weight of everything he had learned and everything he still didn't know left him paralyzed. His father finally turned to him, his expression grim. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll find us soon. And when they do, we need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Jack snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You've been lying to me my entire life. You let me think you were dead. And now you expect me to just follow you blindly? Tell me the truth. All of it." His father hesitated, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Whitaker. Then he sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're right," he said. "You deserve to know." What followed was a story so unbelievable, so horrifying, that Jack felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. His father hadn't died in a car accident. He had faked his death to escape a shadowy organization known only as the Syndicate, a network of powerful individuals who operated in the shadows, manipulating governments, corporations, and even entire nations to serve their own interests. His father had been one of them, a high-ranking operative who had grown disillusioned with their methods. When he tried to expose them, they turned on him, forcing him to disappear to protect his family. "But they never stopped looking," his father said, his voice heavy with regret. "And now that they know you're involved, they'll do whatever it takes to silence you." Jack's mind raced, trying to process everything he was hearing. "And Mom? Is she part of this too?" His father's expression darkened. No. She never knew. But they'll use her to get to you. That's why we need to move fast." Before Jack could respond, the sound of a door slamming open echoed through the warehouse. They all froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Footsteps heavy, deliberate, echoed through the space, growing louder with each passing second. "They're here," Mrs. Whitaker whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's father moved quickly, pulling a gun from his waistband and handing it to Jack. "Take this," he said, his voice firm. "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, don't stop running." Jack's hands trembled as he took the gun, the cold metal feeling foreign and heavy in his grip. He had never fired a gun before, never even held one. But as the footsteps grew closer, he knew he didn't have a choice. The door to the room burst open, and a figure stepped inside. It wasn't Greg, or the detective, or any of the faceless men who had been hunting them. It was someone Jack recognized, someone he had never expected to see. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Sarah, his ex-girlfriend, the woman he had loved and lost, stood in the doorway, her expression cold and unreadable. In her hand was a gun, pointed directly at him. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said, her voice steady but laced with something he couldn't quite place. "But this is how it has to be." Jack's mind reeled. Sarah? How could she be part of this? She had been his rock, the one person he had trusted completely. And now, here she was, pointing a gun at him like he was nothing more than a target. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah's eyes flickered with something regret, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You were never supposed to find out," she said. "But now that you have, I don't have a choice." Before Jack could respond, his father stepped forward, his own gun raised. "Put it down, Sarah," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "This doesn't have to end this way." Sarah's gaze shifted to him, her expression hardening. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she said. "Not after everything you've done." The tension in the room was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. But before he could say anything, a shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. Jack's father stumbled back, a look of shock on his face as a dark stain spread across his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand. "No, no!" Jack screamed, rushing to his father's side. But it was too late. His father's eyes were already glazing over, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Jack," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I tried." And then he was gone. Jack felt like the world had stopped. His father, the man he had thought was dead, the man he had just gotten back, was gone. And Sarah, the woman he had loved, had pulled the trigger. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of grief and rage. "Why?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Why did you do this?" Sarah's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, sorrow, maybe, or regret. "I didn't want to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they made me. They have my sister. If I don't do what they say, they'll kill her." Jack's mind raced. Her sister? Sarah had always been fiercely protective of her younger sister. If the syndicate had her. Before he could respond, Mrs. Whitaker stepped forward, her eyes locked on Sarah. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There's another way." Sarah hesitated, her grip on the gun faltering. But before she could say anything, the sound of more footsteps echoed through the warehouse. "They're coming," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice urgent. "We need to go. Now." Jack didn't argue. He grabbed his father's gun and followed Mrs. Whitaker as she led them through a hidden door and into the night. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then followed, her expression a mix of fear and determination. As they disappeared into the darkness, Jack realized one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. Not even close. The syndicate was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had silenced him for good. But as he ran, one question burned in his mind. Who could he trust? His father was gone. His uncle had betrayed him. And Sarah. Sarah had just shot the man he had spent his entire life mourning. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But the cost of finding it might be more than he was willing to pay. So, what do you think happens next? Will Jack uncover the truth, or will the syndicate silence him forever? The stakes have never been higher, and the danger has never been greater. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. The rain fell in sheets, drenching the city in a cold, unrelenting downpour as Jack stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring out at the skyline. The lights of the city flickered like distant stars, blurred by the rain and the tears he refused to let fall. Below him, the streets were empty, the world seemingly holding its breath as if waiting for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. In his hand, he clutched the file, the one his father had died to protect, the one that held the answers to everything. But now, as he stood there, the weight of it felt almost unbearable. Mrs. Whitaker stood beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She had been with him every step of the way, guiding him, protecting him, even when he hadn't realized it. And now, as they faced the final moments of this nightmare, she remained steadfast, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's over," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. You've done what you needed to do. Jack shook his head, his grip tightening on the file. It's not over. Not really. The syndicate's still out there. They'll keep coming. They'll never stop. Mrs. Whitaker turned to him, her expression softening. Maybe, she said. But you've exposed them. The files are out there now, in the hands of people who can do something about it. You've taken away their power. That's more than most people could ever hope to do. Jack wanted to believe her, but the guilt, the grief, the sheer weight of everything he had lost, it was too much. His father was gone. His mother was in hiding, her life forever altered by the secret she had never asked to be part of. And Sarah. Sarah was out there somewhere, her fate uncertain, her choices a haunting reminder of the cost of this fight. What about you? He asked, turning to Mrs. Whitaker. What happens now? She smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of years of pain and sacrifice. I've been running for a long time, she said. Maybe it's time I stopped. Jack frowned. What are you saying? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was the same one Jack had found in her house, the one of her and his father, standing side by side in a moment frozen in time. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his for the briefest of moments. Take this, she said. Remember him. Remember what he fought for. And remember that you're not alone. Before Jack could respond, she turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the rain like a ghost. He wanted to call out to her, to stop her, but the words caught in his throat. He knew, deep down, that this was her choice. Her final act of defiance against the shadows that had haunted her for so long. Alone on the rooftop, Jack looked down at the photograph in his hands. His father's face stared back at him, young and full of life, a stark contrast to the man he had seen die just hours before. And beside him, Mrs. Whitaker Eleanor, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that had carried her through decades of secrets and lies. He didn't know what would happen next. The syndicate was still out there, their reach vast and their resources endless. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt a flicker of hope. The files were out there, the truth exposed. And while it might not bring his father back,